The impending apocalypse, aka shit, is getting real. The Strait of Hormuz has largely disappeared from the headlines, which in itself should make every one of us nervous. In the modern media age, silence is often mistaken for resolution. If people aren't talking about a crisis anymore, many assume the crisis has somehow gone away. But reality doesn't care about our attention spans, and reality doesn't care about political narratives. If the Strait of Hormuz remains closed for an extended period of time, the consequences will not be measured merely in higher gas prices or temporary inconvenience. They will be measured in shortages, economic collapse, and human suffering on a scale most Americans have never experienced in their lifetimes. For months, roughly one-fifth of the world's oil supply has been effectively trapped behind a geopolitical choke point. So far, most people have not felt the full impact because the global economy has been surviving on a cushion, vast strategic petroleum reserves accumulated over years and decades. Governments and industries have quietly been draining those reserves to keep fuel flowing, supply chains functioning, and consumers from panicking. The problem is that a reserve is not a solution. It is a temporary reprieve. It is a life raft, not a rescue ship. The optimists and political spin doctors rarely mention what happens when that cushion disappears. The experts, the people who actually know what they're talking about, who study these scenarios for a living, refer to a critical threshold called the operational floor, the point at which reserves can no longer function as an effective buffer. Once that point is reached, the system doesn't gently decline. It loses pressure. And when a global energy system loses pressure, the effects cascade everywhere at once. The first casualty is diesel fuel. Most people don't think about diesel because they don't put it in their cars, but diesel is the bloodstream of modern civilization. Diesel moves the trucks that stock grocery store shelves. Diesel powers trains that transport food and medicine across continents. Diesel runs cargo ships carrying goods around the globe. Diesel fuels the farm equipment that plants and harvests our food. When diesel becomes scarce or prohibitively expensive, the entire supply chain begins to fracture. Food doesn't disappear because farmers suddenly stop farming. I've been seeing nothing but farms my entire 2.5 weeks out here in the Midwest. The food disappears because transportation becomes unaffordable and distribution becomes impossible. Fertilizer prices skyrocket because fertilizer production depends heavily on natural gas. Farmers face impossible costs before a single seed is planted. Crops become more expensive to grow, more expensive to harvest, and more expensive to transport. Eventually, those costs become unsustainable. That is when grocery store shelves begin to empty. Not because there is no food, but because the machinery required to move that food no longer functions efficiently. The distinction may sound academic until you're staring at an empty shelf trying to feed your family. That's when it hits home. Meanwhile, factories throughout Europe and Asia begin shutting down. Countries that import nearly all of their energy are hit first and hardest. Nations begin competing for increasingly scarce fuel supplies. Oil prices surge beyond anything seen in modern history. This stops being a story about energy markets and becomes a story about the stability of civilization itself. What we're talking about is not simply expensive gasoline. We are talking about the loss of the invisible infrastructure that allows modern society to function. Energy is to an economy what oxygen is to the human body. Restrict it long enough and every organ begins to fail. It's going to fail. The apocalypse is imminent. The result would not resemble the recession of 2008. It would not resemble the inflation spikes of recent years. It would more closely resemble a global economic cardiac arrest. The Great Depression would suddenly look less like an unthinkable catastrophe and more like a warning we failed to heed. What infuriates me most is not that this scenario exists. Complex societies are always vulnerable to disruption. What infuriates me is the staggering disconnect between the magnitude of the risk and the complacency of those charged with addressing it. We are told everything is under control. We are told prices will come down. We are told not to worry. Meanwhile, reserves continue to decline and the underlying problem remains unresolved. The peace president continues to bloviate about the conflict being resolved. Wars of choice always come with a bill. Politicians love the speeches, the flags, the photo opportunities, and the manufactured patriotism. They are considerably less enthusiastic when the invoice arrives. Yet that invoice always arrives. It arrives in higher prices, broken economies, dead civilians, shattered stability, and consequences that spread far beyond the battlefield. The deafening silence surrounding this possibility may be the most alarming thing of all, because while politicians reassure us and pundits chase the next shiny distraction, the clock keeps ticking. The cushion that has protected us from the full consequences of this crisis is not infinite. It is shrinking every day. And when it finally disappears, reality will arrive all at once. The question is not whether reality cares about our politics. The question is whether we will recognize it before it is too late.